When my son snapped at me over dinner that evening, I didn't say a word back, even though the sound of his voice cut through me in a way I wasn't prepared for, like a sudden gust of cold wind that slips into a warm room without permission. I stood there holding the plate of food I had made with quiet care, the same way I had made dinner for him since he was a small boy who needed help cutting his vegetables and who used to tug at my sleeve asking, "Mama, is it ready yet?" He used to stand beside me on a stool, his tiny hands trying to stir the pot while laughing at the steam that fogged his glasses. And yet, decades later, I found myself in the same kitchen, with the same motions, except now there was no little boy beside me, only a grown man who seemed tired, distant, and burdened by something I couldn't name. That night, when he walked in, I could already sense that something wasn't right, though I didn't want to believe it. He didn't look at me when he dropped his bag on the chair, and when I asked him softly if he wanted his usual tea, he didn't respond. I told myself he probably had a long day. I told myself he might be hungry, might be stressed, might be carrying something from work. And then, when I placed the food in front of him and said, "It's still warm, please sit before it gets cold," he suddenly snapped. "I said I'm not hungry. Why you always do this?" His voice was louder than I had heard in years. It wasn't just the volume. It was the tone, the sharpness, the frustration that felt so unfamiliar coming from him. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I felt like someone had pressed their hand around my chest, not tight enough to break anything, but tight enough to remind me that this world, even inside your own home, can hurt you without warning. I didn't tell him that I had been stirring that same pot for an hour, adjusting the spices slowly the way he liked them, trying to remember each detail he had mentioned in passing over the years about what made dinner feel just right. I didn't tell him that I had been waiting all day for him to come home, just to see him sit down and relax for a moment. I didn't tell him that I had been feeling lonely lately, and his presence in the house was the only warmth I felt during the long hours. I just stood there looking at the plate, at the steam rising gently, at the meal that suddenly felt foolish. And then I stepped back, placing the plate on the counter as quietly as I could because I didn't want even the sound of it touching the surface to upset him more than he already was. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, pulsing like a reminder of every moment we had ever shared, every moment I had hoped we still would. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space as if something in the room bothered him, something larger than the dinner I made. For a second, he glanced at me, but the look wasn't one of connection. It was a look of someone struggling with himself, with the weight he carried, with the expectations he felt pressing against his shoulders. And still, I couldn't help but feel responsible. A mother's heart has a way of blaming itself even when it shouldn't. I wanted to say, "What's wrong?" I wanted to say, "Sit down with me, please." I wanted to say, "Tell me what's hurting you," the way I used to when he fell and scraped his knees as a child. But the words caught in my throat, tangled with old memories and newer fears. So instead I whispered, "It's okay," even though it wasn't, not really. I turned away from him so he wouldn't see the tears forming in my eyes. I've learned over the years that mothers cry quietly, not because they're trying to hide their sadness, but because they're trying not to add to anyone else's burden. I wiped my cheeks quickly, hoping he didn't notice. I picked up a small towel and pretended to clean the already clean counter. The silence that grew between us wasn't loud, but it was heavy, heavy enough to settle in the room like dust that no one knows how to sweep away. And in that silence, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet awareness that sometimes the people you love forget how much you do for them, not because they don't care, but because life blinds them temporarily. I reminded myself that he was my son, my only child, the person I had loved with a depth that had no edge, no limit, no end. And even though his words hurt, even though the tone felt like a door slamming somewhere deep inside me, I knew this wasn't really about dinner. I just didn't know what it was about yet. Not then, not in that moment. All I knew was that I loved him enough to stand there silently, holding my hurt with both hands, waiting for the storm inside him to settle, even if I had no idea how long that would take. I stayed in the kitchen long after he went to his room, the quiet settling around me like a soft blanket I couldn't pull off. And I thought about all the dinners I had made for him over the years, each one prepared with care, each one hoping to bring a moment of comfort after a day that was never easy. And I realized that love isn't always enough to stop the hurt that comes silently, that sneaks in without warning, and that even the closest bonds can fray in small ways until one day the snapping voice tells you what you already feared, that the distance has been growing without your notice. And I wondered when exactly we had stopped sitting together at the table with laughter instead of tension, when I had last seen his smile reach his eyes without a shadow behind it? When did my presence in the room no longer bring comfort, but something he couldn't name? And I felt the weight of years pressing on me, not harshly, not with blame, but quietly, like a fog settling over familiar furniture. And I remembered the nights when he was little, the way he used to chase after me when I called him in from the yard, his small hands reaching for mine, the warmth of his tiny body against mine when he had nightmares, the soft words he would whisper as I held him close, and I realized with a sudden ache that I stayed in the kitchen long after he went to his room, the quiet settling around me like a soft blanket I couldn't pull off, and I thought about all the dinners I had made for him over the years, each one prepared with care, each one hoping to bring a moment of comfort after a day that was never easy. And I realized that love isn't always enough to stop the hurt that comes silently, that sneaks in without warning, and that even the closest bonds can fray in small ways until one day the snapping voice tells you what you already feared, that the distance has been growing without your notice. And I wondered when exactly we had stopped sitting together at the table with laughter instead of tension, when I had last seen his smile reach his eyes without a shadow behind it. When did my presence in the room no longer bring comfort but something he couldn't name? And I felt the weight of years pressing on me, not harshly, not with blame, but quietly, like a fog settling over familiar furniture. And I remembered the nights when he was little, the way he used to chase after me when I called him in from the yard, his small hands reaching for mine, the warmth of his tiny body against mine when he had nightmares, the soft words he would whisper as I held him close. And I realized with a sudden ache that those moments were gone, replaced by a silent house and a room that felt emptier than it should. And I thought of all the small sacrifices, all the mornings I woke before him to make his breakfast, the afternoons I stayed after work to help with homework I didn't understand, the evenings I gave him advice gently, quietly, hoping he would hear it someday. And I understood more than I had ever before that motherhood is a constant balancing act between giving and hoping, between holding and letting go, between being seen and being invisible, and that sometimes the fart must carry what cannot be spoken. And I felt tears forming again, but I held them back, not because I wanted to hide them, but because in that moment, the quiet itself was enough to remind me of all that had been, of all that I still loved. And I thought about how he might be carrying burdens I could never imagine, pressures I could not see, worries that were his alone. And I tried to imagine what he felt in that instant, and I whispered softly into the stillness, "It's okay." Though I knew it wasn't, because the truth is sometimes love alone cannot fix what is broken. It can only witness it. And sometimes the hardest part is standing quietly, feeling your own heartache while hoping the other person will find their way back. And I remembered the small things that used to bring him joy, the way he liked his meals seasoned just so, the way he hummed a tune when he felt happy, the way he told me things in confidence that he never repeated. And I realized that in the years we had been together, I had never stopped noticing him, but perhaps he had stopped noticing me. Or maybe life had simply grown too heavy for either of us to see clearly. And I sat down on the chair I had moved aside earlier, folding my hands in my lap, staring at the floor as if it held answers, feeling my pulse in my ears, feeling the quiet press against my skin. And I thought about forgiveness. Not the kind you offer to others, but the kind you offer yourself for not knowing, for not anticipating, for not protecting your own heart while protecting theirs. And I realized that night that love and hurt can live side by side, quietly, invisibly, and that accepting it is part of the work of being human and of being a mother. And even though I couldn't yet speak to him about what I felt, I could hold it gently inside me, like a small flame that refuses to die. And I understood that the hardest truths are not revealed in arguments or tears, but in the silent moments when you simply witness life as it unfolds, when you see the changes in the ones you love and know that you cannot control them, only support them in the ways you can. And I thought about all the things I wanted to say, all the words that could soothe, all the sentences that could explain. But I knew that right now, in that fragile space, words might break the moment instead of healing it. And so I breathed slowly, feeling the rise and fall of my chest, listening to the quiet that filled the house, noticing the shadows in the corners, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the way the curtains moved gently with the evening breeze, and I allowed myself to simply be, holding my sadness without shame, holding my love without expectation. And I realized that sometimes the most important thing you can do is to wait, to watch, to hope quietly, to let the ones you love find their own way back to the table. And in that quiet, in that ache that is so sharp yet so soft, I felt a small, tentative understanding that this was only the beginning, that one day there might be conversation again, there might be laughter again, there might be recognition of all the years and care, and that I could carry this heartbreak now because it would make room for the healing to come. And I whispered into the dim kitchen, into the empty house, into the spaces that only I could feel,
"It's okay, my son. We will find our way again." And I believed it, even though I did not know how or when, because love in its quiet persistence is patient, and the night held me gently as I waited. And even though the ache would not leave immediately, I understood that enduring it with care, with soft attention, with an open heart was the first step towards the truth I would need to learn. The truth that sometimes your children change, sometimes the relationship bends in ways you cannot anticipate, and sometimes the hardest lessons come from the quiet moments, the snapped voices, the meals you thought would nourish more than the body. And as I sat there still and aching, I felt a small seed of understanding grow that even in heartbreak, even in the snapped words, even in the quiet hurt, there is space for love to remain, to witness, to wait, to heal. And in that stillness, I found the first hint of the lesson I would carry forward, the first fragile thread of hope that even when life shifts unexpectedly, even when the ones we love seem distant, even when dinner becomes a mirror for a greater truth, there is still room to hold, to nurture, to wait, and to love with all the quiet strength a mother has learned over the years.
I remember the mornings in our house when the sunlight would barely touch the curtains, and I would be up first, as always, moving quietly so as not to wake him too early, preparing his breakfast exactly the way he liked it. A bowl of oatmeal with a drizzle of honey, a cup of milk, a slice of toast lightly buttered, and sometimes, if I had a bit of time, a small piece of fruit cut into shapes that I thought would make him smile. And I watched the clock carefully because I knew how much he valued being on time, even when he was a teenager and even now as a grown man. And I thought about how each small act, each carefully arranged meal, each reminder to take his jacket or lunch was my way of showing that I cared, that I was paying attention, that I loved him, even when he didn't notice, even when he complained about the routine, even when he rolled his eyes or muttered, "I know, Mom, I know," because I understood that love sometimes needed to be quiet and patient, unseen but steady. And I remembered how, when he was little, he used to run to the door every morning, backpack bouncing on his shoulders, calling out, "Bye, Mom," with that half smile that always made my heart ache with joy and fear at the same time. Fear because the world was not always gentle, and joy because here was this tiny person who had grown out of my arms, yet was still mine in ways I could not explain. And I carried that sense of responsibility and tenderness with me into each day, folding the laundry, tidying the kitchen, organizing his things for school or work, noticing the little things that most mothers notice without thinking, the slight droop of his shoulders when he was tired, the way his fingers would drum lightly when he was thinking or nervous, the quiet sigh when he felt overwhelmed, the subtle changes in his expression that told me more than words ever could. And I often wondered if he realized how much I watched, how much I listened, how much I remembered. And sometimes I would smile softly to myself, imagining him as the child who used to sneak cookies before school, who used to hide under the table when he was shy around guests, who used to ask endless questions about the stars, the world, the way people worked. And I realized that all of those small moments had shaped the man he had become, and that the love I poured into him, silently, day after day, had built the foundation of the relationship we had now. Even if it sometimes felt fragile, even if the snap of a voice could pierce the calm of an evening like it did the other night. And I reminded myself that every mother carries these memories, these quiet treasures, these invisible threads that hold the family together, threads that can be strained or frayed, but rarely broken entirely. And as I went about the day, I found myself noticing details that I might have ignored before, the way his shoes were slightly scuffed, as if he had rushed out the door, the way his jacket smelled faintly of the office, the note on the fridge reminding him of a meeting he might have forgotten, and I felt both pride and a quiet sadness. Pride because he was becoming independent, capable, self-sufficient, and sadness because that independence sometimes meant that I was no longer central to his daily life, no longer the first person he turned to with his troubles or joys, and I understood, with a tender ache, that this was natural, that children grow, that they must, but the heart can take time to adjust, to understand that being loved and being needed are not always the same thing. And that evening, when he snapped, all those years of quiet devotion seemed suddenly fragile, as though one misstep could undo the work of decades. And yet, deep inside me, I knew that the love we shared could endure, even through misunderstandings, even through moments of frustration, even through the quiet hurt that sometimes filled the spaces between us. And I remembered how, when he was a teenager, he would come home after school with friends, and I would prepare a snack for all of them,
arranging it on plates, making sure there was enough for everyone, even though I knew they would eat quickly and forget the thought behind it. And I realized that this pattern of quiet care had been my constant, a thread that had remained even as he grew, even as the world changed, even as our routines shifted. And I thought about the small victories, the smiles, the conversations that had built up over time, the moments when he would unexpectedly lean against my shoulder for comfort, the times when he would laugh so freely that I could feel the sound in my chest, the way he would sometimes ask my advice on things I thought he would never care about. And I understood that all of those small moments were the foundation of our bond, and that no single harsh word, no single snapping tone could erase what had been built, though it could shake me, though it could hurt me, though it could make me question myself in the stillness of the night when I lay awake replaying the scene over and over, wondering if I had done something wrong, wondering if I had missed a signal, wondering if I had failed him in some unseen way. And I reminded myself that parenting is full of these moments of doubt, these moments of quiet fear, these nights of reflection when all you can do is hold the love in your chest and hope it reaches the person you care for most. And I thought about the laughter that had once filled the kitchen, the way he would tell stories about his day at school, about friends, about games, about silly things that made us both laugh. And I realized that laughter was a bridge, a connection that didn't need explanation, and that even though it had faded somewhat over time, the bridge was still there, waiting for me to cross when he was ready, waiting for him to recognize it, to rebuild the connection, to remember the quiet care that had never faltered. And I thought about the meals, the conversations, the mornings and nights that had become invisible in their consistency. And I understood that consistency, though not unnoticed sometimes, is a form of love as profound as any words, and that it is this consistency that would allow me to endure the snaps, the silences, the small hurts that life brings. And I let myself feel that quiet strength, the kind that comes from years of holding a heart outside yourself, of giving without expectation, of loving without conditions, of waiting patiently for a child to see, in their own time, what has always been there. And I reminded myself that patience is the mother's gift, that endurance is the mother's secret, that hope is the mother's quiet companion, and that in the soft hours of the evening, as I cleaned the kitchen, as I washed the dishes he would eventually use, as I folded laundry he would eventually wear, I carried all of this inside me, steady and sure, a foundation upon which we could rebuild, a love that no snap, no harsh word, no momentary hurt could dismantle, a love that had been growing silently for years. And I understood that this is what being a mother truly is: to love quietly, to care steadfastly, to endure patiently, to hold hope even when the world seems indifferent, and to trust that one day the heart you nurture will find its way back to the warmth it has always known, and that the lessons, the memories, the quiet acts of care are never wasted, that every small gesture counts, that every shared moment leaves a mark, and that even in the simplest routines, preparing a meal, tidying a room, folding laundry, noticing the smallest changes in expression, there lies a profound truth, a thread that connects you to the person you love across all the distance, all the silence, all the fleeting frustrations. And I sat there in the soft light of the evening, feeling it all, feeling the weight and beauty of what had come before, and knowing in the deepest part of my heart that the love I carried quietly, steadfastly, patiently would endure, and that this foundation would carry us through the moments that hurt, the words that cut, and the evenings when he did not yet know how to ask for the comfort I had always offered. Even as I went about the following days, I noticed the subtle shifts in our home, the quiet signs of tension that had been building without my noticing, the small pauses in conversation, the way he lingered at the doorway longer than usual before entering a room, the way he sometimes stared at the floor instead of meeting my eyes when I spoke to him. And I wondered if perhaps I had missed something along the way, some sign that his frustrations were not just about a single dinner, but about something deeper, something that I had not yet understood. And I began to reflect on our life together, on the years of routines that had once been comforting but might now feel restrictive or burdensome to him, on the expectations we both carried, even unknowingly, on the way love sometimes manifests as care and yet can be mistaken for control or obligation.
And I thought about the mornings when I used to wake before him to prepare his breakfast, arranging it with attention to detail, ensuring that each part of the meal was just right, not because I needed recognition, but because it was my way of showing that I saw him, that I remembered his preferences, that I loved him without needing a return. And yet I wondered if he had ever truly noticed, or if the years of quiet devotion had simply become invisible to him as small, everyday things so familiar that they no longer register. And I remembered how, when he was little, he would run to the door excitedly to leave for school, his backpack bouncing on his small shoulders, calling out a cheerful goodbye, and how I would stand in the kitchen watching him go, heart swelling with pride and fear all at once. And I realized that those moments, though fleeting, had been filled with more love than I could possibly express. And I carried them forward in memory, knowing they shaped the bond we shared, even as our connection had transformed with time, even as he had grown into an independent young man with responsibilities I could not imagine. And yet he was still my son, still a part of me, still someone I had loved with every fiber of my being. And I held on to that truth as I navigated the subtle tensions that had begun to surface, noticing that he sometimes spoke more tersely than necessary, that he sometimes avoided small talk, that he sometimes seemed lost in thought while standing near me. And I understood that these were not failures on my part, nor indications that he no longer cared, but signs that life, with all its pressures and complexities, had weighed on him, and that perhaps he had not yet found the language to express what he was feeling. And I reminded myself that patience is a mother's constant companion, that quiet observation, gentle understanding, and enduring presence are often the most profound ways to show love, and that sometimes the greatest acts of care happen without words, in the simple rhythms of life, in preparing a meal, in noticing the way someone breathes, in silently offering support without expectation of acknowledgement. And I reflected on all the years we had shared, the milestones, the small victories, the setbacks, the nights spent comforting him when he cried, the days spent celebrating his achievements, the countless conversations in the kitchen, the living room, the car, the quiet moments in between, the shared laughter, the unspoken understandings. And I realized that these had built an unshakable foundation that could carry us through the present tension, even when the sharp words of one evening seemed to suggest otherwise. And I thought about the ways I had tried to guide him, sometimes with gentle suggestions, sometimes with silent example, showing him how to face challenges, how to treat others with kindness, how to persevere in the face of difficulty, how to hold on to integrity and patience even when the world was unfair. And I wondered if he had absorbed these lessons as I had hoped, or if he was now testing them, testing me, testing our bond. And I allowed myself to feel both concern and hope, understanding that the path of a child's growth is never linear, that independence can come with confusion, that maturity can emerge slowly, and that my role was to remain steadfast, to provide a safe anchor, to offer love without conditions, to wait for him to navigate his own struggles, while knowing I would be there, quietly and consistently, as I always had and as I always would. And I reflected on the small gestures that had marked our daily life, the way he sometimes left notes on the fridge, reminders, scribbles, messages that I had once read and smiled at, the way he sometimes paused to help with small tasks, the way he sometimes laughed at things only I could understand, the tiny signs of connection that proved the bond remained, even when unspoken, even when overshadowed by frustration. And I realized that noticing these moments is as important as responding to the larger conflicts, that love thrives in observation as much as in action, that understanding grows from patience as much as from conversation, and that sometimes allowing space for growth, allowing room for mistakes, allowing the quiet presence of a mother who cares without judgment is the greatest gift one can offer. And I thought about the day he snapped at me over dinner, the words still echoing in my mind, and I understood that the incident was not a failure, but an opportunity to witness, to reflect,
to recalibrate, to love more intentionally. And I allowed myself to feel the sting, the sadness, the momentary hurt without letting it define the entire relationship, because a single moment does not erase decades of love, of care, of shared life. And I reminded myself of the times when he had returned from school or work with a smile, with a story, with a need for comfort that I had provided. And I recognized that the ebb and flow of closeness is natural, that tension can exist alongside deep affection, that moments of friction do not negate the years of nurturing that have shaped a life. And I thought about the ways he had surprised me, the ways he had demonstrated thoughtfulness, the ways he had shown empathy and consideration, the ways he had grown into someone capable and kind. And I understood that these truths coexist with the frustrations, that both are real, and that love encompasses them all, that patience and endurance are required to navigate the complex emotions of human relationships. And I allowed myself to accept that tension is part of growth, part of understanding, part of learning to love across the difficulties. And I thought about the mornings, afternoons, and evenings I had spent quietly providing care, the dinners prepared, the snacks arranged, the small touches of comfort offered consistently without acknowledgement. And I understood that this invisible labor, this unrecognized love, forms the bedrock of a mother's connection to her child. Even when the child is grown, even when frustrations emerge, even when words are sharp and emotions raw. And I felt the deep, steady reassurance that the bond remained, even in moments when it seemed tenuous. Because love, when patiently given, endures. And I resolved to continue offering it quietly, faithfully, gently, without expectation, allowing him the space to process, to mature, to find his own way, while knowing my presence, my care, my unwavering attention was a constant thread tying us together, a lifeline of love and patience that would support him through the challenges he faced, and that would sustain me through the quiet moments of reflection, the evenings of worry, the days of doubt. And I realized that this understanding, this awareness, this calm acceptance is itself a kind of strength, a quiet resilience born of decades of care, of observation, of enduring love, and that by holding it inside me, by breathing through it, by maintaining my steady presence, I was preparing not only to navigate the current tension, but to nurture the long-term relationship that had always been and would continue to be. A relationship built on patience, consistency, and love. A bond that withstands sharp words, fleeting frustrations, and the inevitable changes that life brings. A love that is resilient because it is grounded in decades of quiet devotion. And I felt a quiet, enduring hope that he would come to understand, to recognize, to appreciate, to reconnect in his own time, in his own way, with the love that had always been present, patiently, quietly, faithfully, enduringly, and that our bond, though tested, would continue to grow and deepen, even through misunderstandings, even through frustration, even through the silent ache of hearts that love too deeply to stop noticing. And I knew with certainty that this patient, steady love is the core of motherhood, the truth that sustains both parent and child, the quiet, unshakable foundation on which all else can stand, and that it was this understanding, this patience, this unwavering presence that would carry us through the days, the weeks, the months to come, as life unfolded with all its challenges and surprises, and that by holding this truth in my heart, I could face each day, each tension, each snap of a word with calm, with clarity, with quiet strength, with unwavering love.
It started slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. Small moments that seemed insignificant, but gradually built a tension I could no longer ignore.
like water gathering behind a dam. And I noticed it in the way he would linger over his phone at the table, eyes darting across messages instead of engaging in conversation, in the way he would sometimes grunt in response to questions I asked about his day, or brush past me without acknowledgement, and I felt a tightening in my chest, a quiet worry that grew with each small sign, a sense that something had shifted between us, though I could not yet name it. And I reflected on all the years I had spent preparing meals, keeping the house in order, organizing schedules, attending to his needs, and I wondered if it had all become invisible, taken for granted, or worse, resented. And I thought about the way he had snapped at me over dinner, a reaction so sharp that it lingered in the quiet of the night, echoing in my mind and heart, and I realized that while I had been focused on giving love through action, I may have overlooked the subtle emotional currents that flowed beneath our interactions, the unspoken feelings, the frustrations, the pressures he carried. And I tried to reconcile my intentions with his responses, wondering if love, when given quietly and consistently, is always recognized, or if it can be misunderstood. And I remembered the times when he had been younger, when he had come home from school with excitement, when his laughter had filled the rooms, when he had sought my guidance eagerly and with trust. And I mourned, silently, for the ease of those connections, while understanding that growth and independence inevitably alter the dynamics. And I felt both pride and sorrow, pride in the man he was becoming, sorrow for the tension that now shadowed our home. And I tried to reach him in small ways, suggesting dinner plans, asking about his day, offering to help with tasks he might need. And I noticed a mixture of responsiveness and resistance, a push and pull that left me uncertain, unsure whether to speak, to wait, to act, to hold back, to assert boundaries, to give space. And I felt the weight of responsibility, the balance between guidance and freedom, between love and respect, between presence and absence. And I thought about all the nights I had stayed up worrying about him, wondering if I had done enough, if I had done too much, if my intentions were clear, if my care was sufficient, if my silence had been heard, if my words had been understood. And I realized that parenthood is an endless exercise in observation, reflection, adjustment, and trust, that no single moment defines the relationship, but patterns, accumulated over time, do. And that every gesture, every word, every reaction contributes to the invisible architecture of love and understanding. And I tried to pay attention more carefully, to listen more attentively, to observe more deeply, noticing the smallest signs, a frown that lingered too long, a sigh that spoke volumes, a glance that avoided mine, a voice that held an edge of frustration or impatience. And I began to see that these small moments were the early tremors of something larger, something that needed attention before it became a rupture. And I reminded myself that love requires vigilance, awareness, and humility, that it must be flexible yet steady, compassionate yet discerning, and that sometimes the hardest lessons come not from dramatic events, but from the accumulation of small, quiet signals that we might otherwise overlook. And I felt both fear and determination. Fear that I might fail him, determination to remain patient, compassionate, and steadfast, to maintain the connection we had built over decades, to nurture trust even in the face of subtle resistance. And I reflected on the pattern of his growing independence, the choices he made without consultation, the way he carried himself with a mixture of confidence and uncertainty. And I realized that he was navigating a complex world, one that demanded maturity he was still learning to wield, and that my role was not to control but to support, not to direct but to guide gently, not to react impulsively, but to respond with clarity and empathy. And I tried to embody this understanding in every interaction, from the casual questions at breakfast to the more delicate conversations in the evening, from the shared chores to the silent gestures of care. And yet, despite my efforts, the tension persisted, manifesting in terse responses, hurried exits, and moments of emotional withdrawal. And I felt the familiar ache of doubt, the quiet gnawing worry that I had somehow misread the situation, that I had failed to perceive the underlying needs, the unspoken grievances, the hidden fears. And I reflected on the lessons I had learned as a parent, that communication is not just words, that love is not only action, that understanding is not only empathy, but that each must work in harmony. And when one is missing or unbalanced, friction emerges, subtle but persistent. And I began to notice how he sometimes spoke sharply to me about trivial matters, about chores, about food, about routines. And I realized that these were not truly about the surface issues, but expressions of deeper tension, of frustration, of unmet needs, of a search for autonomy. And I tried to approach these moments with compassion, to separate the words from the emotions behind them, to see the pain or struggle expressed indirectly, to respond not with defensiveness, but with curiosity and patience. And I often reminded myself that this is the nature of relationships, especially between parents and children who are growing into independence, that love must be flexible, that boundaries must be clear, that understanding must be continuous, that patience must be renewed daily, and that one must always observe, listen, and adjust without losing sight of the core bond, the trust, the love that has been cultivated over years. And I considered how small irritations can grow into larger conflicts if left unexamined, how subtle patterns of withdrawal or snapping can signal unmet needs, and how easily silence can be misinterpreted. And I realized that the recent dinner incident was a culmination of these small signals, that it was not isolated but connected to a series of unspoken pressures. And I reflected on my own responses, my own emotions, my own need to balance care with space, involvement with detachment, presence with autonomy. And I felt it, the weight of it, the responsibility and the hope intertwined. And I reminded myself that clarity and calmness in response are vital, that overreaction can escalate, that thoughtful observation can illuminate hidden truths, and that even when conflict arises, it is an opportunity to understand more deeply, to connect more intentionally, to love more deliberately, to nurture resilience. And I watched him, noting the subtle expressions, the small gestures, the fleeting changes in posture, the soft exhalations, the tension in his voice. And I realized that these were messages, signals of inner turmoil, attempts to communicate feelings that were difficult to express directly. And I understood that my role was to witness these messages, to honor them, to respond with patience and guidance, to maintain the steady thread of love and support that had always been the foundation of our relationship. And I felt both the challenge and the privilege of this responsibility, the quiet burden and the profound joy of being present fully for a child navigating his path, of being the anchor in moments of storm, the safe harbor in times of confusion, the calm presence that does not waver. And I resolved to continue observing, listening, reflecting, and responding, knowing that the small moments, the subtle gestures, the quiet patience would carry us through, would repair the tension, would reinforce the bond, and would ultimately allow him to feel seen, heard, understood, and loved. And I reminded myself that this is the essence of parenthood, the ongoing task of balancing care and autonomy, presence and freedom, observation and action, understanding and guidance, all while holding in one's heart the unwavering, patient, enduring love that can weather friction, misunderstandings, and the inevitable growing pains of life, and that by embodying this patience, this awareness, this gentle vigilance, I could navigate the tension without losing sight of the love that underlies every action, every word, every small gesture, and that in doing so, I was preparing not only for the resolution of this conflict, but for the continued growth of a relationship that has always been, and will always be, rooted in the quiet, enduring, unconditional love of a mother. As the days went on, the tension in our home became harder to ignore, manifesting in subtle ways that spoke louder than words, in the way he would close doors more firmly than necessary, in the sharpness of his tone when responding to simple questions, in the quiet moments when he would sit at the table with his hands folded, staring at the plate before him, and I could feel a distance growing that I could neither see nor touch, but could sense in every interaction, every glance, every unspoken pause. And I began to notice patterns I had not recognized before. The way he would sigh as he entered a room, the way he would glance at his phone repeatedly as if seeking an escape. And I realized that his frustrations were not only with me or with the dinner I had prepared, but with a larger, more complex array of emotions that he was still learning to navigate. Pressures from school, from friends, from expectations, both internal and external. And I understood that what had seemed like a small outburst was a symptom of deeper undercurrents, a manifestation of stress, of growing independence, of the struggle to find his voice in a world that demanded maturity before he felt ready. And I reflected on my own reactions, the way I had instinctively sought to soothe, to fix, to correct. And I recognized that sometimes my interventions, however well-intentioned, might have felt like constraints, like pressure, like judgment. And I considered how difficult it must be to feel constantly guided, constantly watched, and yet deeply loved. And I reminded myself that my role is to provide support, not control, guidance, not restriction, presence, not pressure. And I tried to embody this understanding in every action, every word, every look, every gesture. And yet I could feel the frustration bubbling beneath the surface in both of us, a quiet tension that threatened to tip over with the slightest provocation. And I thought about the dinners, the conversations, the small chores, the minor disagreements, each one adding a layer to the complex tapestry of emotion that now filled our home. And I realized that the smallest irritations could be magnified when combined with underlying stress, with unspoken needs, with emotional fatigue. And I reminded myself to breathe, to step back, to observe before responding, to approach each situation with calm, clarity, and empathy. And I noticed how he would sometimes leave the room abruptly, how he would sometimes answer questions with monosyllables, how he would sometimes avoid eye contact. And I understood that these were his ways of coping, of signaling discomfort, of trying to maintain composure in a situation that felt overwhelming. And I felt both concern and compassion, recognizing the challenge he faced, the need for independence, the desire to assert himself, the struggle to balance personal feelings with familial expectations. And I reflected on my own role in this, how my constant presence, my attentiveness, my attempts to guide could be both comforting and suffocating, depending on perspective. And I resolved to adjust my approach, to allow more space, to listen more intently, to act less impulsively, to respond with patience rather than reaction, to prioritize understanding over immediate correction. And I began to notice the small gestures that still connected us, the brief smiles he offered when he thought I wasn't watching, the way he sometimes lingered near me in the kitchen, the way he would sometimes quietly help with a chore, the small signs of care and recognition that persisted despite the tension. And I held on to these moments as evidence that our bond was not broken, merely strained, and that love, though sometimes tested, endures through patience, understanding, and steadfast presence. And I considered how each conflict is an opportunity to learn more, to connect more deeply, to understand more fully, to witness the evolving complexities of the person I had raised. And I felt the weight of responsibility, the challenge of balancing empathy with guidance, freedom with boundaries, care with detachment. And I reminded myself that being a parent is an ongoing practice, a continual adjustment, a constant calibration of love and attention, and that patience is the foundation on which these adjustments rest. And I began to see that the tension, though uncomfortable, was also a sign of growth, a signal that he was asserting himself, exploring boundaries, testing independence, and that my role was not to suppress these natural developments, but to support them with calm, steady love. And I reflected on the countless small moments that had prepared both of us for this stage, the lessons of compassion, resilience, respect, and responsibility that had been woven into daily life, sometimes explicitly, often quietly, subtly. And I realized that the current conflict was a culmination of these lessons being applied, interpreted, and tested, and that my responses now could either reinforce or weaken the foundations we had built. And I felt a renewed determination to act with awareness, intentionality, and heart, to meet frustration with understanding, to respond to sharp words with calm, to offer guidance without control, to maintain presence without intrusion, to love without expectation. And I noticed how even small adjustments in tone, posture, timing, and attention could shift the dynamic, reduce tension, invite conversation, and create space for empathy and understanding. And I began to observe more deeply the ways in which he expressed his needs indirectly, the hints in his body language, the inflections in his voice, the pauses between words, the subtle cues of frustration, fatigue, or desire for autonomy. And I use these observations to guide my responses, choosing words carefully, moving gently, remaining emotionally steady. And I noticed how even the smallest acknowledgement of his feelings could ease tension, invite dialogue, and foster a sense of being understood, seen, and respected. And I realized that communication extends beyond words, that empathy often manifests as attentiveness, that patience communicates love more effectively than correction, and that nurturing a relationship through tension requires constant awareness, reflection, and deliberate action. And I reflected on my own emotions as well, the pride and worry, the hope and fear, the desire to protect and the need to step back, the urge to fix and the discipline to observe. And I realized that embracing these emotions without being controlled by them is part of the art of parenthood, that maintaining calm, consistent presence amidst conflict is a form of strength and love, and that through observation, reflection, patience, and gentle guidance, even moments of friction can be transformed into opportunities for understanding, growth, and deeper connection. And I held on to this understanding as I navigated each tense interaction, each sharp word, each subtle withdrawal, each sigh, each avoidance, knowing that the cumulative effect of steady, calm love could sustain the relationship, repair the strains, and reinforce the enduring bond between parent and child. And I committed to continuing this approach, embracing the challenges, witnessing the emotions, offering support, nurturing patience, and holding fast to the quiet, steadfast love that forms the foundation of our connection. And I reminded myself that even when conflict persists, the enduring presence of care, empathy, and understanding can guide both parent and child through the tension, toward clarity, reconciliation, and renewed connection. And I felt a quiet reassurance in this, knowing that love, when patient, observant, and consistent, is resilient enough to endure frustration, miscommunication, and the inevitable challenges of growth and independence, and that by holding this perspective, I could navigate the current conflict with grace, calm, and hope, and that the bond we shared, though tested, would continue to grow, deepen, and strengthen over time.
It all came to a head one evening when the house was quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant tick of the clock marking time, as if holding its breath for what was about to unfold. And I remember standing in the kitchen, dishes in my hands, feeling a familiar weight in my chest, a premonition that something significant was about to occur. And he entered, expression tense, eyes avoiding mine at first, a storm barely contained behind the steady rhythm of his movements. And I sensed that whatever he was carrying inside could no longer be held back. And when he finally
finally spoke, the words cut through the calm like a sudden gust of wind, sharp and unanticipated, revealing truths I had only begun to suspect, emotions I had only half recognized. And I realized that this was the moment where patience, observation, and empathy would be tested to their limits, for the dynamics we had carefully navigated for years were shifting abruptly, and the subtle tension that had been building now erupted into clarity. And I listened, heart pounding, as he spoke of feelings of frustration, resentment, and confusion that had accumulated silently, hidden beneath polite exchanges and daily routines. And I felt the weight of every unspoken grievance, every ignored sigh, every avoided confrontation that had brought us to this point. And I recognized that my attempts to maintain calm, to observe, to respond with patience, while still necessary, had not fully addressed the depth of his struggle, and I realized that love alone, though powerful, sometimes requires direct engagement, candid dialogue, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. And I remembered the long nights of reflection, the hours spent considering how to balance guidance with independence, presence with space, care with detachment, and I understood that those lessons would now be applied in real time, in the midst of raw emotion. And I steadied myself, taking slow breaths, centering my thoughts, reminding myself that responding with calm, clarity, and empathy would be more effective than reacting impulsively. And as he continued to speak, I began to grasp the scope of what he had been feeling, the ways in which small misunderstandings had compounded, the subtle signals I had missed, the moments when my attempts to guide had felt like constraints rather than support. And I felt a pang of regret, not for loving him, but for not recognizing sooner the intensity of his need for autonomy, respect, and understanding. And I considered how easily good intentions can be misinterpreted when not accompanied by clear communication. And I reflected on the delicate balance between maintaining parental guidance and honoring a child's emerging independence. And I realized that this was a turning point not only for him, but for me as well. An opportunity to deepen understanding, to recalibrate my approach, to strengthen the bond through honesty, patience, and compassion. And as he shared more, detailing the frustrations that had simmered beneath the surface, the unspoken expectations, the feelings of being misunderstood, and the yearning for acknowledgement, I felt the full weight of the situation, the responsibility to respond with care, the challenge of providing support without overstepping, the necessity of listening deeply without judgment. And I remembered the countless small lessons I had tried to impart about empathy, resilience, respect, and communication. And I realized that now it was time to apply these lessons not as instructions, but as guiding principles in action, to meet his raw emotions with steady presence, to validate his feelings while gently correcting misunderstandings, to offer guidance while allowing him space to assert his own voice. And as I did so, I felt a shift in the atmosphere, subtle at first, like the first rays of sunlight piercing through clouds, and I recognized that acknowledgement and understanding can diffuse tension, restore trust, and create an opening for reconciliation. And I focused on speaking calmly, choosing words that conveyed empathy without minimizing his experience, affirming his feelings while maintaining my own emotional balance. And I noticed the way his posture began to relax, the tension in his shoulders softening, the guarded expression on his face giving way to something more vulnerable, more open, more receptive. And I realized that this was the essence of the turning point, the moment where clarity, honesty, and compassion converged to transform conflict into connection. And I reflected on the years of care, the patience, the small gestures of love and support, and understood that these had laid the foundation for this moment, that our bond, though tested, remained strong enough to withstand this confrontation, and that the careful cultivation of trust over time allows for moments of raw truth to be expressed safely. And as we continued to communicate, I listened without interruption, asked gentle questions to clarify, offered understanding without judgment, and I noticed the first hints of relief, the recognition that his feelings were being heard, the subtle nods, the softening gaze, the slow, measured words that began to replace terse statements. And I felt a quiet hope rising, a sense that this turning point could mark the beginning of renewed understanding, mutual respect, and deeper connection. And I reminded myself that such moments are rare, precious, and require presence, patience, and courage from both sides, and that navigating them successfully can transform tension into insight, conflict into clarity, and distance into closeness. And I committed fully to the process, maintaining calm, offering empathy, responding thoughtfully, and observing attentively, knowing that every word, every pause, every gesture carries significance. and that the cumulative effect of these conscious actions would define the trajectory of our relationship going forward. And I felt both the gravity and the promise of this turning point. The recognition that honesty and vulnerability are essential for growth, that love requires both patience and courage, and that the willingness to face discomfort, to listen deeply, and to respond with empathy can turn a moment of conflict into a lasting opportunity for understanding, healing, and strengthened connection. And I realized that this was a pivotal moment not just for him, but for me as well, an opportunity to witness, reflect, adjust, and engage with care, to transform frustration into insight, tension into clarity, and distance into renewed closeness. And I held this awareness in my heart as I continued to navigate the conversation, feeling the weight of responsibility, the depth of love, and the quiet power of compassionate presence, knowing that through patience, empathy, and understanding, we could emerge from this turning point not only with resolution, but with a stronger, deeper, more trusting relationship. And I felt a quiet sense of hope, a belief that even the most challenging moments can be transformed through presence, awareness, and unwavering love, and that this moment, though difficult, was a necessary step toward a more honest, connected, and resilient bond between parent and child.
As the evening progressed, the conversation deepened, and I felt the weight of every word he shared, the hidden emotions that had been accumulating over time, the quiet frustrations, the unspoken fears, and the small resentments that had grown silently. And I realized that these were not mere outbursts, but expressions of a complex mix of feelings that demanded careful attention, empathy, and understanding. And I listened intently as he described the pressures he felt at school, the misunderstandings with friends, the internal conflicts between wanting independence and fearing failure. And I recognized the universality of these struggles, the way they resonate with all growing children. And yet, in that moment, they felt intensely personal, as though the world had contracted to this small kitchen, this small house, this single charged conversation. And I held my breath, aware that the way I responded could either soothe or inflame, could either bridge the gap or widen it. And I reminded myself to remain calm, to listen more than I spoke, to validate feelings rather than dismiss them, and to approach each sentence with patience, clarity, and love. And I noticed how his expressions shifted subtly, from defensiveness to vulnerability, from frustration to a tentative willingness to be heard. And I realized that vulnerability is a fragile gift, one that must be met with care, respect, and steady presence. And I felt a deep sense of responsibility, understanding that my own emotions, if unbridled, could derail this turning point. And so I concentrated on maintaining composure, on offering gentle words, on using pauses effectively, on letting him lead when necessary. And I observed how even small affirmations, a nod, a soft tone, a thoughtful question, could ease tension, invite openness, and build trust. And I reflected on my past approaches, recognizing moments when my intentions, though good, may have been misinterpreted. And I committed to adjusting, to listening more fully, to giving space while remaining emotionally present. And as he shared stories of recent challenges, of interactions that had hurt or frustrated him, of the times he had felt unseen or unheard, I felt a swell of empathy, recalling my own experiences as a child, the moments of yearning for understanding, the silent battles fought internally. And I realized that this parallel of experiences created a bridge between us, a shared human understanding that transcends age and roles. And I expressed acknowledgement, saying softly, "I hear you, I understand, and I'm here." And I saw the immediate effect in the way his posture softened, the tension in his shoulders eased, the guarded look on his face giving way to trust. And I understood that these small signals are as important as words, that connection is often nonverbal, that patience, attention, and presence communicate love more effectively than any lecture. And I reflected on the times I had rushed to correct, to advise, to intervene, and recognized that sometimes the best response is simply to listen, to validate, to witness, to honor the emotions being expressed. And I felt gratitude that this turning point allowed for such an exchange, for honesty, for clarity, for mutual understanding. And I encouraged him gently to share more, to articulate what he truly felt, to explore the roots of his frustrations. And I observed how, with each disclosure, a weight seemed to lift from his shoulders, how the initial storm of emotion transformed into clarity, how tension gave way to dialogue. And I realized that this is the essence of meaningful communication, that the act of being heard and understood is profoundly healing. And I felt my own emotions shift in response,
from concern and worry to relief and hope, as the barriers between us softened, as the walls built over years of assumptions and misinterpretations began to come down. And I marveled at the resilience of our bond, the strength of love, and the capacity for growth, understanding, and reconciliation. And I reflected on the importance of timing, of readiness, of creating a safe space for dialogue, recognizing that these elements are crucial for turning points to succeed. And I acknowledged that my calm, steady presence had contributed to this moment, and that his willingness to be open was equally vital. And I felt a quiet pride in the mutual effort, in the willingness to face discomfort, to confront difficult truths, to embrace vulnerability, and to allow growth to occur. And I realized that this turning point was not an isolated incident, but a culmination of years of nurturing, teaching, modeling patience and empathy. And now at last, these lessons were being internalized and expressed in a tangible, transformative way. And I committed to continuing this approach, to responding with care, to maintaining presence, to observing, listening, and guiding with gentleness. And I noticed how the tension in the room diminished further, replaced by a fragile but growing sense of connection, trust, and understanding. And I felt hope that this moment would serve as a foundation for more open communication in the future, for a stronger, healthier relationship. And I reflected on the power of honesty, of vulnerability, of compassionate listening, recognizing that these elements are the cornerstone of meaningful relationships. And I resolved to carry these insights forward, to apply them consistently, to honor the emotions of others while maintaining my own balance. And I marveled at the subtle, yet profound transformation that had begun, the shift from frustration to dialogue, from defensiveness to openness, from distance to closeness. And I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to witness and participate in this growth, to share in the unfolding journey of understanding. And I recognized that turning points, though often challenging and uncomfortable, are necessary for development, healing, and connection, and that embracing them with patience, empathy, and calm presence allows relationships to emerge stronger, more resilient, and more meaningful. And I held this understanding in my heart, feeling both the weight and the promise of the moment, knowing that the steps we take in the midst of difficulty define the future trajectory of our bond, and that through awareness, care, and unwavering love, we can transform even the most challenging moments into opportunities for lasting connection, growth, and trust. And I felt a quiet, steady hope rising within me, a belief that the relationship, tested but not broken, could emerge renewed, fortified by honesty, vulnerability, and the power of compassionate presence. And I resolved to carry this awareness into every future interaction, to nurture understanding, patience, and love, and to honor the turning points that shape, strengthen, and sustain the bonds that matter most, knowing that the journey of connection, though sometimes fraught with difficulty, is ultimately a path of hope, growth, and enduring love.
In the days following that turning point, a subtle shift settled over our home, not dramatic or sudden, but a gentle, almost imperceptible easing of tension that allowed space for healing, understanding, and renewed connection. And I noticed how small gestures carried new significance, how shared glances conveyed empathy, how conversations flowed with a patience and attentiveness that had previously been absent. And I reflected on the power of listening deeply, validating emotions without judgment, and responding with calm and care, realizing that these actions, repeated consistently, had the ability to mend, to rebuild, and to strengthen the bonds that had been strained. And as we navigated daily routines together, preparing meals, tidying rooms, completing schoolwork, and sharing quiet moments in the living room, I observed a newfound willingness in him to communicate openly, to express feelings before they festered, to ask for guidance while also asserting independence. And I recognized that the turning point had not only revealed hidden frustrations, but it also created an opportunity for growth, teaching both of us the value of honesty, patience, and understanding. And I felt gratitude for the lessons embedded within the conflict, the subtle reminders that love is both steady and flexible, requiring attentiveness, presence, and a willingness to adapt. And I noticed how our interactions became richer, more nuanced, with moments of gentle humor, quiet encouragement, and mutual respect. And I reflected on the importance of celebrating these small victories, of acknowledging the progress made, of reinforcing positive communication patterns. And I realized that these incremental changes, though seemingly minor, were the foundation of lasting transformation, that patience, consistency, and empathy create an environment where trust can flourish, and that nurturing this trust requires conscious effort, reflection, and presence. And I held these insights close as I guided our interactions, offering gentle reminders, supportive words, and calm encouragement. And I saw the impact in the way he responded, more openly, more thoughtfully, more willingly. And I felt a quiet pride in his growth, in his willingness to engage, in his courage to be vulnerable. And I recognized that this evolution was a shared journey, a collaborative process between parent and child, requiring understanding, adaptation, and mutual respect. And I reflected on my own emotional growth. The patience cultivated, the empathy deepened, the awareness sharpened. And I recognized that navigating conflict with care and intentionality not only benefits the child, but transforms the parent as well, enhancing insight, resilience, and the capacity for love. And as the days turned into weeks, I noticed patterns of positive communication emerging, how he would approach me with questions, concerns, or ideas, how he would pause before reacting to frustrating situations, how he would express appreciation for small gestures. And I realized that these shifts were not isolated incidents, but the result of consistent practice, modeling, and conscious effort. And I marveled at the quiet power of presence, of calm guidance, of attentive listening. And I felt a deep sense of fulfillment knowing that the patience, reflection, and empathy I had invested were yielding tangible results, that our relationship had weathered the storm, and that a stronger, more resilient bond was emerging. And I considered how each interaction now carried layers of understanding, how even disagreements were handled with greater respect, how emotions were expressed more openly and constructively. And I recognized the profound impact of turning points when met with care, courage, and intentionality. And I reflected on the interconnectedness of our experiences, how past lessons, daily habits, and conscious efforts converged to create this space for resolution, how the commitment to patience and understanding paved the way for growth, how love, when steady and responsive, can transform tension into trust. And I felt a quiet gratitude for the opportunity to witness and participate in this evolution, for the chance to apply lessons of empathy, patience, and presence in real time, and for the resilience demonstrated by both of us. And as our home became filled with calmer energy, with more open communication, with subtle but meaningful signs of care and respect, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here, the challenges navigated, the emotions experienced, the lessons learned. And I recognize that resolution is not a single event, but a process, an ongoing practice of listening, understanding, adjusting, and responding. And I felt a profound sense of hope, knowing that the patterns established now would support continued growth, strengthen our connection, and provide a foundation for future challenges. And I noticed how moments of frustration were now met with thoughtfulness, how disagreements prompted discussion rather than silence or withdrawal, how the emotional climate of our home had shifted subtly but significantly. And I felt comfort in the knowledge that love, when combined with empathy, patience, and intentional communication, has the power to heal, to restore, and to fortify bonds. And I reminded myself to continue nurturing these patterns, to model calm responses, to validate feelings, to provide guidance without pressure, to observe with attentiveness, and to embrace the ongoing nature of growth, understanding that each day presents opportunities to strengthen connection, repair misunderstandings, and deepen trust. And I felt a quiet contentment in witnessing this transformation, recognizing that resolution, like love, requires presence, care, and unwavering attention, and that through consistent practice, empathy, and thoughtful engagement, relationships can emerge stronger, more resilient, and more fulfilling. And I held these insights close, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment, hope, and gratitude for the opportunity to navigate the complexities of emotion, connection, and growth with compassion, patience, and love, knowing that the lessons of this turning point would resonate long into the future, shaping both our hearts and our bond in meaningful, lasting ways.
As the weeks passed, I began to notice subtle but meaningful changes in both him and myself. The way he approached challenges with a new sense of thoughtfulness, the way he paused before reacting, the way he considered my perspective while expressing his own. And I reflected on how powerful these small shifts were, the quiet yet profound effect they had on the atmosphere in our home, on our conversations, and on the way we interacted daily. And I felt a deep appreciation for the process of resolution, realizing that it is not a sudden fix, but a gradual, ongoing evolution that requires patience, attentiveness, and unwavering presence. And I observed how our daily routines, once punctuated by tension or misunderstanding, now carried moments of collaboration, mutual respect, and gentle humor. How setting the table, preparing meals, discussing homework, or simply sharing a cup of tea became opportunities to connect, reinforce trust, and nurture understanding. And I recognized that these everyday moments, often overlooked, are the building blocks of lasting reconciliation, the foundation upon which stronger, healthier relationships are built. And I felt gratitude for the opportunity to witness and contribute to this growth, to model empathy, patience, and thoughtful communication, and to observe how these principles were being internalized and reciprocated. and I reflected on the journey we had taken together, from the initial tension and misunderstandings through the turning point that forced honest dialogue to the steady application of reflection, presence, and empathy that now guided our interactions. And I understood that true resolution is less about a single moment of agreement and more about the continuous effort to understand, support, and respond with care. And I marveled at the resilience of love when paired with patience, insight, and intentionality, the way it adapts, heals, and strengthens over time. And I noticed how even moments of disagreement were now navigated with respect, curiosity, and openness, how he would express concerns without fear of dismissal, how I would respond with validation and guidance rather than frustration. And I felt a quiet pride in both of us for embracing this new way of relating, for allowing honesty, vulnerability, and mutual understanding to guide our relationship. And I reflected on the lessons embedded in these experiences, the importance of listening more than speaking, of observing carefully, of responding thoughtfully, of validating emotions, of providing guidance with gentleness. And I realized that these principles extend far beyond our home, offering insight into all human relationships. And I felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that the work invested in patience, empathy, and presence was now bearing fruit, that our connection had not only survived conflict, but emerged stronger, more nuanced, and more resilient. And I noticed how moments of joy, laughter, and shared understanding began to outnumber moments of frustration or tension, how the atmosphere in our home felt lighter, warmer, more inviting. And I recognized that this transformation was the direct result of conscious effort, reflection, and intentional communication. And I felt gratitude for the opportunity to guide and witness this growth, for the lessons learned about empathy, patience, and love, and for the trust and openness that had been cultivated over time. And I reflected on the subtle ways in which this resolution reshaped my own perspective, teaching me to respond with calm, to observe deeply, to engage with intention, to honor emotions without judgment, and to embrace the ongoing process of connection and understanding. And I realized that these insights would continue to guide my interactions, both within our family and beyond, shaping the way I communicate, relate, and nurture relationships. And I felt hope and confidence that the foundation we had rebuilt together would sustain us through future challenges, supporting growth, resilience, and closeness. And I marveled at the quiet beauty of this transformation, how patience, empathy, and presence had turned conflict into understanding, tension into trust, and distance into renewed closeness. And I held this awareness close, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment, hope, and love, knowing that our journey of resolution, though gradual and sometimes difficult, had created a lasting, meaningful bond, one strengthened by honesty, vulnerability, and compassionate engagement. And I reminded myself that the lessons learned here are not fleeting but enduring, shaping both our hearts and our interactions in ways that will continue to resonate. And I felt a quiet, steady peace in knowing that love, when paired with patience, empathy, and mindful communication, has the power to heal, restore, and fortify, creating bonds that are resilient, nurturing, and deeply meaningful. And as I observed the subtle shifts in his demeanor, his willingness to communicate openly, his attentiveness to both his own emotions and the emotions of others, I felt a profound sense of hope, confidence, and fulfillment, knowing that the journey of resolution is ongoing, that it requires constant care, reflection, and presence, and that through conscious, compassionate engagement, relationships can transform, deepen, and flourish. And I carried this understanding with me, feeling gratitude for the opportunity to nurture, witness, and participate in this evolution, to embrace the power of empathy, patience, and attentive presence, and to honor the transformative potential of resolution, love, and human connection. As I observed the subtle shifts in his demeanor, his willingness to communicate openly, his attentiveness to both his own emotions and the emotions of others, I felt a profound sense of hope, confidence, and fulfillment, knowing that the journey of resolution is ongoing, that it requires constant care, reflection, and presence, and that through conscious, compassionate engagement, relationships can transform, deepen, and flourish. And I carried this understanding with me,
feeling gratitude for the opportunity to nurture, witness, and participate in this evolution, to embrace the power of empathy, patience, and attentive presence, and to honor the transformative potential of resolution, love, and human connection.
As the days gently unfolded into weeks, I found myself reflecting deeply on everything that had transpired, on the tension that had once clouded our home, on the turning points that had forced honesty, on the moments of patience and empathy that had gradually nurtured understanding. And I realized that this journey was about far more than a single argument or a single lesson. It was about the ongoing process of connection, of observing, of listening, of responding with care, and of allowing space for growth. And I felt a quiet gratitude for the resilience that both he and I had shown, the courage to be vulnerable, to face uncomfortable truths, to engage openly, and to embrace change. And I recognize that these are the very elements that make relationships strong, meaningful, and enduring, that love is not simply a feeling, but a practice, one that requires attention, presence, patience, and empathy. And I reflected on the subtle ways in which our home had transformed, how the energy shifted from tension to calm, from misunderstanding to communication, from frustration to patience. And I noticed how each small act of kindness, each moment of attentiveness, each gentle correction or supportive word contributed to an environment that nurtured growth, trust, and emotional safety. And I felt a profound appreciation for the ordinary moments, the quiet breakfasts shared, the homework discussions, the preparation of meals, the simple walks, the shared laughter over small jokes that now carried new depth, new meaning, and a sense of connection that had been absent before. And I thought about how easily such moments could have been overlooked, taken for granted, or lost in the rush of daily life. And I vowed to continue honoring them, to remain present, attentive, and intentional, knowing that these small, consistent efforts build the strongest bonds, the most resilient relationships, and the deepest sense of trust. And I reflected on the lessons this journey had imparted, about the power of patience, the importance of listening more than speaking, the value of validating emotions, the impact of gentle guidance, and the strength that emerges from vulnerability met with empathy. And I marveled at how these lessons extended beyond a single relationship, offering insight into all human connections, teaching that understanding and compassion are always possible when one approaches others with a calm, attentive heart. And I observed how he now approached challenges with more thoughtfulness, how he paused before reacting, how he expressed concerns respectfully, and how he began to appreciate the nuances of communication. And I felt a deep sense of pride and fulfillment, knowing that the growth I witnessed was not forced, but nurtured, that it was a product of consistent, patient engagement, and that the trust we had rebuilt would serve as a foundation for future challenges, for continued dialogue, for enduring love. And I thought about the moments when I had faltered, when impatience or frustration had crept in, and I forgave myself gently, acknowledging that perfection is neither expected nor required, that growth is a process, that resilience comes from learning and adjusting, and that even in moments of difficulty, love and presence can guide the way. And I reflected on the subtle yet profound impact of turning points, of honest dialogue, of vulnerability, of intentional presence, understanding that these moments, though sometimes uncomfortable, are necessary for transformation, for healing, and for the deepening of bonds. And I felt a quiet hope that these lessons would not be forgotten, that they would continue to shape our interactions, that they would foster empathy, patience, and understanding in all our relationships. And I thought about how much stronger, richer, and more resilient our bond had become, how trust and openness now characterized our communication, how moments of tension were now met with dialogue rather than withdrawal, how emotions were expressed constructively rather than buried or misinterpreted. And I felt gratitude for the opportunity to witness, participate in, and nurture this growth, knowing that these experiences were shaping both of us in lasting ways, instilling patterns of understanding, connection, and compassion that would endure for years to come. And I reflected on the beauty of everyday life, on how ordinary moments hold extraordinary potential when approached with presence, empathy, and love. And I realized that the work of building meaningful relationships is never truly complete, that it requires ongoing care, attention, and reflection, and that each day presents new opportunities to strengthen bonds, deepen trust, and cultivate understanding. And I felt a deep sense of peace in knowing that
Despite the challenges, despite the frustrations, despite the mistakes, our relationship had not only survived, but had grown stronger, more resilient, and more compassionate. And I held this awareness close, cherishing the lessons learned, the trust rebuilt, the love strengthened, and the hope for continued growth, knowing that the journey of connection, though sometimes difficult, is ultimately a path of joy, learning, and enduring love. And I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the quiet warmth of the home, the steady presence of shared understanding, the subtle but profound bond we had nurtured. And I whispered a gentle promise to continue listening, caring, guiding, and loving, to remain present, patient, and empathetic, to honor the journey and to embrace the lessons of the past as we moved forward together. And in that moment, I felt the profound truth that relationships, like gardens, flourish when tended with care, intention, and love, that growth emerges from patience and presence, and that the bonds we nurture through understanding, compassion, and gentle guidance will endure, strengthen, and bloom, carrying the lessons, hope, and love of our journey into the future. And I held this knowledge close, feeling a quiet, steady hope, gratitude, and fulfillment. And I knew that the story we had written together would continue, unfolding with each day, each conversation, each shared experience, and that through patience, empathy, and love, our relationship would continue to thrive, to heal, and to grow, creating a foundation of trust, understanding, and enduring connection that would shape our lives in meaningful and lasting ways.
As I sit quietly now, reflecting on everything that has unfolded, I realize how much this journey has taught me about patience, empathy, understanding, and the quiet power of love expressed through presence. And I feel a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons embedded in each moment, each challenge, each small victory, knowing that every struggle, every misstep, and every conversation has shaped both of us in ways that are lasting and meaningful. And I think about the early days when tension and frustration clouded our home, when misunderstandings seemed insurmountable, when emotions ran high and communication faltered. And I remember the weight of those moments, how heavy and discouraging they felt. And yet I also remember the turning points, the moments of honesty, the times when we each paused, reflected, and chose to respond with care rather than reaction. And I recognize now that these were the seeds of change, the quiet catalyst that transformed our relationship, that nurtured trust, empathy, and understanding. And I feel a profound sense of hope in knowing that relationships can recover, grow, and flourish when approached with intention, patience, and love. And I reflect on the subtle ways in which these changes manifest, how small gestures, gentle words, thoughtful pauses, and acts of presence carry more weight than we often realize. And I marvel at the resilience of the human heart, the capacity to forgive, to adapt, to understand, and to nurture connection even after disappointment, frustration, or hurt. And I see how this resilience has shaped both of us, how it has allowed us to rebuild trust, restore openness, and create a home filled with warmth, attentiveness, and emotional safety. And I think about the moments of shared laughter, the quiet conversations over meals, the collaborative problem solving, the gentle guidance, and the acknowledgement of feelings. And I recognize how all these seemingly ordinary moments contribute to extraordinary transformation, how they lay the foundation for enduring connection. And I feel gratitude for the opportunity to participate in, guide, and witness this growth, to model empathy, patience, and thoughtful communication, and to observe how these qualities are internalized and reciprocated. And I reflect on my own journey as much as his, the patience cultivated, the awareness deepened, the understanding expanded. And I recognize that resolution and growth are never one-sided, that nurturing a relationship requires reflection, intentionality, and care from all involved. And I feel a sense of fulfillment knowing that we both embraced this process, that we both contributed to the healing, that we both committed to building trust, understanding, and connection. And I consider the broader lessons that extend beyond our home, how empathy, patience, and attentive presence can transform any relationship, how listening without judgment, validating feelings, and responding thoughtfully create a space for growth, healing, and mutual respect. And I feel a profound appreciation for the subtle but powerful ways in which love manifests when guided by these principles. And I see how these insights shape my interactions with others, not only within our family, but in friendships, community, and the world. And I feel gratitude for the opportunity to carry these lessons forward, to continue nurturing relationships with care, patience, and presence, and to embrace the ongoing journey of understanding, empathy, and connection. And I reflect on the importance of celebrating small victories, of acknowledging progress, of reinforcing positive patterns. And I see how doing so fosters resilience, trust, and emotional safety. And I feel a quiet pride in both of us for recognizing the value of growth, for practicing vulnerability with courage, for responding to challenges with thoughtfulness, and for allowing love to guide our actions.
And I recognize that this transformation, though gradual, is lasting, and that the lessons we have learned will shape our relationship for years to come, offering insight, strength, and hope. And I hold close the understanding that relationships, like gardens, flourish when tended with care, intention, and consistent attention, when they are nurtured with empathy, patience, and love, and that even amidst conflict or difficulty, there is always potential for growth, restoration, and deeper connection. And I feel a profound sense of peace in knowing that the bonds we have strengthened are enduring, that the trust rebuilt is resilient, and that the love we have cultivated is rich, meaningful, and transformative. And I reflect on the quiet beauty of these lessons, how ordinary days carry extraordinary potential when approached with presence and care, how patience and empathy transform tension into understanding, and how intentional love fortifies relationships against the challenges of life. And I feel gratitude for every experience, every conversation, every challenge, and every moment of growth that brought us to this place. And I realize that while the journey is ongoing, the foundation we have built will support continued growth, understanding, and connection. And I close my eyes, feeling a sense of fulfillment, warmth, and hope, knowing that through patience, empathy, love, and intentional presence, relationships can heal, deepen, and flourish, that lessons learned with care and attention endure, and that the bonds we nurture with understanding and compassion will continue to thrive, shaping our hearts, our home, and our lives in meaningful, lasting ways. And in this quiet reflection, I am reminded that love is a journey, patience is a practice, and empathy is a gift, and that together they create a foundation of trust, connection, and resilience that carries forward into every tomorrow. And I feel a deep, steady peace in knowing that we have navigated the challenges, embraced the lessons, nurtured growth, and created a home filled with understanding, hope, and enduring love. And that this journey, though not always easy, has been profoundly worth it, shaping our hearts and our lives in ways that will continue to resonate and inspire for years to come.